Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for another segment of our learning journey. If you haven't already, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Creating this content takes a great deal of time, and your support, especially through likes, sends a clear message that you value this work and want to see more. I promise to continually improve the quality of what I deliver to you. Today, we're heading down a road that may make some of us uncomfortable, but it is a journey through truth, and the history must be told. We're exploring the harsh realities of starvation and food insecurity among enslaved people in Jamaica. The historical record provides compelling evidence that enslaved people in Jamaica did indeed die of hunger due to both systemic food shortages and deliberate mistreatment by plantation owners. Between 1780 and 1787 alone, approximately 15,000 slaves died from starvation during a period of precarious food supplies. This occurred within a broader context where Jamaican slaves lived at the bare edge of subsistence even in good times and faced chronic malnutrition that contributed to extraordinarily high mortality rates on sugar plantations. The causes of these food shortages were multifaceted, ranging from external factors such as war-induced trade disruptions and natural disasters to intentional deprivation by plantation owners who prioritized profit over slave welfare. While some plantation owners developed provision ground systems to address food security issues partially, these measures were insufficient to prevent widespread hunger and starvation-related deaths throughout the slavery period. The food security situation for enslaved people in Jamaica was precarious from the earliest periods of British colonial rule. The plantation system that dominated the island was primarily designed to maximize sugar production for export, with slave subsistence treated as a secondary concern. During the slave years, each Caribbean slave colony handled slave subsistence differently, with some slaves expected to live only on rations, while others were given provision grounds to grow their own food. A basic diet provided to enslaved people was fundamentally inadequate for sustaining healthy life. Slaves who were fed from plantation rations typically received minimal sustenance, with newly arrived Africans during the seasoning process receiving only a herring and a pint of flour a day, and a few plantains if in need. This bare subsistence level was deliberately maintained to keep enslaved people dependent while minimizing costs for plantation owners. The monotonous and nutritionally deficient diet consisted largely of corn and preserved fish, with little access to fresh vegetables, fruits, or animal protein, except in peripheral areas where slaves had time to fish or raise animals. The provision ground system emerged as a partial solution to food insecurity, though it also served the economic interests of plantation owners. These small plots of land were allocated to enslaved people to grow their own food, particularly crops like yams, sweet potatoes, cassava, and taro. The system allowed plantation owners to reduce their food costs while requiring slaves to work additional hours beyond their plantation labor. To secure adequate nutrition, access to provision grounds was regulated by plantation owners, with slaves typically granted time to work their plots on Sundays and alternate Mondays, except during harvest periods. Documentary evidence clearly establishes that enslaved people in Jamaica died from hunger and starvation-related causes. A most dramatic example occurred during the 1780s, when unstable food supplies during 1780 to 87 caused the death through starvation of 15,000 slaves. This massive loss of life represented a significant portion of Jamaica's enslaved population and demonstrated the vulnerability of the slave food system to external shocks. The mortality rates on Jamaican sugar plantations were extraordinarily high even under normal circumstances. From 1829 to 1832, the average mortality rate for slaves on sugar plantations was 35.1 deaths per 1,000 enslaved people. While not all of these deaths were directly attributable to starvation, Chronic malnutrition was a contributing factor that weakened immune systems and increased susceptibility to disease. Slaves were working and living with barely adequate nourishment, and in times of hard work would often be starved. Individual plantation records provide additional evidence of hunger-related suffering. Thomas Thistlewood's diary, covering his management of enslaved people from the 1750s through the 1780s, documents systematic food deprivation. To learn more about the evil of Thomas Thistlewood, please watch our videos about this notorious individual. The links are provided in the description section. For most of the 1780s, Thistlewood's slaves suffered from malnutrition due to intentional mistreatment. If any enslaved person was caught eating the plantation's produce, they were brutally flogged. While his slaves complained of hunger and starvation, Thistlewood continuously entertained guests with lavish meals. This stark contrast illustrates how food deprivation was often used as a tool of control and punishment. The seasoning period for newly arrived Africans was particularly deadly, with hunger playing a central role in the high mortality rates. Newly imported slaves, already weakened by the Middle Passage, were kept at subsistence levels, while being forced into immediate hard labor. Desperation drove some to extreme measures, with Africans eating young canes for energy, and some even consuming a duck feathers, guts and all. These accounts demonstrate the severe hunger that characterized the early period of enslavement for many Africans. Food shortages affecting enslaved people in Jamaica resulted from both structural economic factors and deliberate policies by plantation owners. The American Revolution created a major disruption to food supplies, as many of the Caribbean plantations imported food from North America, including the United States. So, when the United States declared independence, imports were drastically cut. This led to widespread malnutrition among slaves, as plantation owners found themselves unable or unwilling to secure alternative food sources. Natural disasters compounded these problems, with subsistence crises followed drought, storm, hurricane, and wartime shortages of imported supplies. A combination of successive hurricane years, 1780, 1781, and 1784, creating conditions that led to mass starvation. A concentration on sugar monoculture made the islands particularly vulnerable to such disruptions, as little land was dedicated to food production for local consumption. Economic pressures also contributed to food insecurity. During the period from 1776 to 1782, the sugar profit went down while the price of importing goods went up. This inverse relationship meant that the plantations had even less money to import food for their slaves, which heavily contributed to their malnutrition. Plantation owners prioritized maintaining their export production over ensuring adequate nutrition for their enslaved workforce. Beyond these systemic factors, intentional food deprivation was used as a method of control. Plantation managers deliberately kept slaves hungry to maintain dependency and prevent resistance. The case of Thomas Thistlewood illustrates the practice, where slaves were prohibited from eating plantation produce under threat of brutal punishment, even as they starved. This use of hunger as a disciplinary tool was not uncommon among Jamaica's slaveocracy. Provision grounds were introduced to ease food insecurity among enslaved people in Jamaica, while benefiting plantation economics. These small plots allowed for cultural continuity and occasional market participation through crops like yam, cassava, and sweet potato. However, the system was severely flawed. Enslaved individuals tended these plots after long, grueling days in cane fields with limited and revocable time to work them. Women bore extra burdens, managing cultivation, child-rearing, and food selling. In times of crisis, natural disaster, or war, provision grounds failed to ensure food security. Fundamentally, enslaved people's access to food was subject to the unstable will of plantation owners. Food insecurity among Jamaica's enslaved population had dire health consequences, drastically lowering survival rates. Data from the Mesopotamia plantation 1762 to 1832 show a 30% reduction in life expectancy from cane field labor alone. Infant mortality rates were horrifying, often around 50%, due to maternal malnutrition and poor child feeding practices. Chronic hunger led to physical impairments, illness, and susceptibility to disease. Malnourished mothers gave birth to underweight babies, continuing a cycle of ill health. With more deaths than births, Jamaica's slave population could not sustain itself, forcing continued importation. Malnutrition, therefore, wasn't just a health crisis, it was a demographic. This means Jamaica had to import more enslaved people because of the deaths of enslaved people. Simply put, a replacement. Let me conclude by saying, the historical evidence conclusively demonstrates that enslaved people in Jamaica did die of hunger due to food shortages, both chronic and acute. The death of 15,000 slaves from starvation between 1780 and 87 represents only the most dramatic example of a persistent problem that characterized the entire period of slavery on the island. These deaths resulted from a complex interaction of factors, including economic priorities, that subordinated slave welfare to profit maximization, external disruptions to food supplies, natural disasters, and deliberate use of hunger as a tool of control. The provision ground system, while providing some measure of food security and cultural autonomy for enslaved people, was insufficient to prevent widespread hunger and starvation. The fundamental structure of the plantation system, with its emphasis on export crop production and minimal investment in slave welfare, created conditions where food insecurity was endemic and mass starvation possible during times of crisis. These findings illuminate the brutal reality of slavery in Jamaica, where human beings were treated as expendable resources whose basic nutritional needs were secondary to economic considerations. The legacy of this food insecurity contributed to the demographic catastrophe of Jamaican slavery, where the enslaved population could not sustain itself without constant importation of new victims of the Atlantic slave trade. Understanding this history is crucial for comprehending both the immediate suffering of enslaved people and the long-term demographic and social consequences of the plantation system in the Caribbean. Thank you for joining us, and please remember to share this content with others. Until next time.